thing I'll comment about that is that it struck me the other day when I was listening to, you've probably seen these interviews with the former defense secretary of, Trump's secretary of defense, who's saying that, Trump was thinking about sending missiles into Mexico and they had to really calm him down. Well, today there was this article, Esper, that's his name, the secretary of defense. And today he said in this article with Josh Rogan, who was the kind of Washington Post, House neocon, that when Trump was in office, Esper stayed in office one reason he stayed was to prevent Trump from pulling out U.S. forces from Korea, and so they really have and they really disagreed with him on a number of things. But that was one thing that he really disagreed with Trump on. And it struck me that, the way a lot of these national security people here are talking, it's like, well, we can control Trump and that kind of thing. And I would bet you that the South Korean military has the same ideas about Yoon, because if he does anything really sort of nutty, they will try to, stop him from doing it. That may be one possible restraint on him. But that's just sort of neither here nor there. But I think the South Korean military, which used to be like the primary the primary institution in South Korea that sort of held the country together through force, they may have a lot more influence under this administration than they did previously. So why are they so happy about this guy? Well, it's pretty simple. He follows the U.S. line totally, and so as do many South Korean right wingers. Basically, this line is, and this is held in Japan too by the Liberal Democratic ruling party. Basically, the line is the U.S. is the supreme military power in East Asia, and the Japan and the ROK, South Korea, are essentially subservient partners to the big enchilada, the chief imperialist of East Asia, and so the ROK and Japan have this really close military relationship with the United States, but they're both, in Korea, of course, there's a U.S. commander who's during times of war, he's in charge of all Korean forces as well as American forces in Korea. So. In some ways they're more less sovereign than Japan is, but South Korea has actually been lately and over actually kind of historically more sort of independent and more disagreeing more with overall U.S. policy, and this was certainly true during Moon Jae-in. Moon. They were after Moon from the moment he took office. And, like I mentioned, Josh Rogan, I was in Korea, in Gwangju, when Moon was elected. And, I'm writing a story about the interview I had with him. And immediately I see a tweet from Josh Rogan, South Korea just elected an anti-American president. And, they were just on his case at red baiting him from the very moment he took over. And the main thing was he was acted a little bit independently of the U.S. in terms of making the peace with North Korea. And as we know, he really was instrumental in getting, Trump to meet Kim Jong-un, and he was having his own negotiations with North Korea. But when the North Koreans and the South Koreans under Moon tried to move ahead on some projects that could, bring them closer together and sort of end the enmity, the U.S. intervened and would not let them do it. And one of the classic examples when things really started to go south, I hate to use that term, was when these negotiations were going on, was when North and South Korea had agreed to, South Korea was going to help North Korea restore its railroad system, which is dilapidated. South Korea has this incredibly modern, fast trains and everything. The U.S. UN command, which of course controls all movement across the border on land, the UN command let them have a sort of inaugural meeting where North Korean and South Korean officials went to Kaesong, which was the office of cross-border talks. Kaesong is actually in North Korea. They let them have this sort of ceremony to start this railroad project. But as soon as South Korea wanted to move, the first thing they had to do was move, a train across. They wanted to go into North Korea and sort of see what the problems were, the railroads. And so they wanted to take the railroad and go across the border. That was stopped early on, and they never got it back. And the U.S. said that would be like evading this. That would the sanctions are there. We can't allow this interaction between even South and North Korea. And if you just think for a minute, what if that project had gone forward? There could have been an economic development of the railroads. Maybe even investment. And there would have been a stake for both of them in keeping this project alive, but it was stifled, and everything else they tried to do that involved any kind of cross-border interaction was vetoed by the UN command. And so Moon was trying his hardest to work within the confines of this structure, and he pushed he pushed as much as he could. But he was really, condemned for that. And throughout his presidency, like I said, he was red baited. It was really nasty. I mean, you had this guy, this lunatic Chinese guy, Gordon Chang, who was like basically calling him, he was calling him a, puppet of Kim Jong-un and a, pro North Korean, basically an agent inside the South Korean government. And this was, said on CNN and all kinds of networks and other, if you talk to anybody who's been, part of the policy discussions here, that this really extreme dislike of Moon and the liberals in South Korea, and it's just they hammered on him the whole time, and I think they really wrecked any chance of any kind of cross-border, any kind of agreement between North and South Korea, and which is a real tragedy. And so I think, Yoon is for all the things the U.S. wants. The U.S. wants to have Japan and South Korea to stop their so-called squabbling and, get it together and join together and be close allies again, forget Japanese history of war crimes, let's just put the past away. And they've been trying to do this for years, basically. And Yoon says he wants, he wants to do that. We want to make the relationship with Japan closer. Yoon also has been talking about we have to strengthen the U.S. South Korean alliance, and so on. So it's not clear whether they're going to go along with this anti-China direction of the U.S. alliances in Asia. That's still unclear, but he's certainly going to take steps to really strengthen the U.S. posture in Korea and in East Asia in general. But the thing to remember is that it doesn't mean he's going to go along. He's going to go along with everything. And I think I just mentioned China. Xi Jinping just invited him to China, so that'll be interesting to see if he goes, because Moon wanted to keep relations with China on an even keel and not go into this China's an mortal enemy of freedom kind of talk that you hear from the U.S. now. But it's also important to look back in history and see how much the U.S. They always have these they prefer to have the right wing in power in Korea. And historically they had, in the first 40 years or so, there was, authoritarian, two very authoritarian regimes that they supported. But even when the right wingers are in power, the U.S. meddles in their politics. I mean, when Syngman Rhee, who was, the U.S. brought him in 1945 he was the president of South Korea through the Korean War until he was toppled in 1960 by a revolution. And the U.S. during the Korean War, they actually tried to organize a coup against Ri because he was always talking about marching north and trying to go back and retake the north and stuff. And they tried to force him out, and it didn't work. And then when he was thrown out, they were real happy because they didn't like a lot of his policies. But then a year later, when Park Chung-hee, the general, took over in a military coup, the U.S., Kennedy met with him right away, and they started working with him right away. So they like to have these sort of tough guy authoritarian leaders. But even Park had massive differences with the U.S. And it's interesting to see the history of Park, especially like the U.S. during the 70s, when the U.S. was, at 75, we got kicked out of Vietnam, and the U.S. was sort of, before that was under Nixon, was doing this sort of Vietnamization, where you have the Asian soldiers doing the fighting. At that time, there was the U.S. Nixon unilaterally pulled out a whole division of the U.S. Army, the 7th Division. There was 2 divisions in Korea of the U.S. Army, the 7th Division and the 2nd Division. And he just yanked out the 7th Division. And this freaked out Park Chung-hee. And so there was this period of a few years in the 70s when there was a lot of tension. And then, so what I'm saying is that just because there's a right winger in there doesn't mean the U.S. is not going to put pressure on them. They prefer to have them. But there's a whole history of this, and there's also a whole history of attacking people on the left. And there's this one thing I want to mention, which is that we've kind of come full circle. And I did some articles on this in 2016. I guess it was 2017. But when under Park Geun-hye, the last president, who was she was kicked out of office after this, big candlelight movement to force her out because people felt she was so corrupt. While she was in trouble, I started noticing there was a speech by the CEO of the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, which is a huge player in any debates around Korea here. They're like a military industrial think tank, right? And he made these public comments. He was speaking at a conference I was attending, and he was warning people about the next election, saying there's a strong strain in the left parties that America is the problem. And he was really concerned about the left coming to power, that no one really knew Moon Jae-in would take it at that point. And so, from the very beginning, they were going after him. And at first it was just like, oh no, the left is going to take over. And then it was like, okay, this particular progressive has taken over. And, as soon as Moon Jae-in came in, Victor Cha, who was this official at the CSIS, he basically lectured Moon, not to take unilateral action on North Korea and avoid unconditional economic assistance, et cetera, et cetera. So they started hammering him, and I think that I think it's a very dangerous situation with somebody like Yoon now who doesn't have any real seems he's very weak in understanding the dynamics of the relationship, the history of the relationship. And he just makes these political comments like, he's going to do a unilateral, strike on North Korea, a preemptive strike. And so I think the U.S. is probably going to try to control that kind of, firing off comments like that, because they don't want to have, everything they want to have happen in Korea, they want to have happen under U.S. control. So they're not going to let them go off and declare war on North Korea or take drastic measures that might force a war. And so I think they're going to play the U.S. is going to play the traditional, like let's push them here, push them there, like they've always played in South Korea. And finally, I just want to. This morning I was going over the latest Indo-Pacific strategy of the Biden administration, which is on the White House website. And it's just basic statements about where things are going. Some parts of it are kind of hilarious when they talk about the history of American involvement in Asia. I was tweeting about that a little bit this morning. But the thing is, like, from this paper, which is very easy to find, by the way, and it's like 12 pages or so. It's very clear that they say the intensifying American focus is due to these challenges from the PRC, China. China is combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological might as it pursues a sphere of influences in the Indo-Pacific and seeks to become the world's most influential power. Sounds a lot like the U.S. during the Cold War. And then they go on to attack the coercion and aggression that spans the globe. They have one overseas military base, and I believe it's in East Africa, and I believe it's mostly a place that it's basically maritime security kind of place where they can help shipping if Chinese shipping gets in trouble or something like that. They don't have bases like we have all over the world, so they're really exaggerating this threat. And I think that Korea is going to be caught in the middle because Japan is playing a very hawkish role. Japan wants to really pressure China and raise the stakes. And the U.S. is using that, saying, look, Japan's doing it, why don't you do it too? And I think we're going to see that kind of interplay. And as the situation clearly, North Korea, Kim Jong-un is very dissatisfied with the fact that the talks broke down and there's been no movement, and Biden has made he's put no importance whatsoever on Korea. He's barely recognized that it exists. And despite my antipathy toward the Korean right and this new president, I was a little bit shocked by the low-level delegation that the U.S. sent to South Korea for his inauguration. I mean, this is supposed to be, one of our closest military allies, and they send the spouse of the vice president. They sent the labor secretary. There's nothing wrong with those guys, but I mean, it seems like it should be a much higher level of respect for South Korea as such a close ally. And so I think, I'm sure that the people in Korea that are behind you and we're a little bit disappointed by that too. But the U.S. I just want to say that the military presence is growing, and the other day in I think it was Kyoto News Service had this very good analysis of how Okinawa is now even more strategic to the U.S. than it used to be. And this is the kind of problem within the empire that's going to blow up at some point. There'll be another crisis in Japan over these bases. I'm sure that's going to happen. But the fact is that all this tough talk on China is based on having this vast military apparatus in Asia, from Korea to Okinawa to Japan to Guam, like I said at the beginning. And I think that is what we as activists and people trying to push to a more peaceful world and a more pro-peace kind of policy really need to focus on this, and the absolute undemocratic nature and the unfair burden that the people of Okinawa have to bear to have these huge bases in their land. And this also goes, of course, for South Korea, where there's been these THAAD missile batteries. And that's another thing. Yoon said he might want to have another THAAD battery. And so this could cause deeper tension. So I'll just end it there by saying we really need to focus on that vast military empire that's still building day after day.
Thank you so much, Tim. It was an unreasonable expectation to limit your talk within two. Thank you again for sharing your knowledge and analysis of the complexity in the situation of the Korean Peninsula in the current global turmoil, and in particular, the Biden administration's vision against China, with the US as the head of the global empire, as well as the right-wing South Korean administration as one of its subservient partners. Now let's hear from Dr. Chan.
Okay, so let's see if I could, which one? Let me know what you are seeing. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
How about this one? Do you see my full slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure and honor to join the Massachusetts Peace Section, New England Korea Peace Campaign, and Code Pink. And I'm especially honored to have to participate in the webinar with Tim Chirac, and he's, as we all agreed, by far the best American journalist covering Korea and Northeast Asian security affairs and U.S.-Korean relations. And I have, over the years, I've learned so much from him, and I have a true admiration and respect. So it's a great honor. Yes, Yoon Seok-yeol was inaugurated yesterday. Before I begin my presentation, let me start with several updates. One is from New York Times article on Yoon's inauguration. It's report that South Korea was ready to present an audacious plan that will vastly strengthen North Korea's economy and improve the quality of life for its people. Only if, according to Yoon, only if. Whenever people say only if, it's kind of it's trouble, it's disturbing. Only if North Korea genuinely embraces a process to complete denuclearization. So it means that the jargon that technical term CVID, it means that. So what Yoon is saying is that he's basically proposing it's old wine in a new bottle. Especially he's trying to implement the failed policies of previous conservative administrations, including Lee Myung-bak, who is right now serving in prison term, and the impeached, disgraced Park Geun-hye, who happened to actually attend the inauguration ceremony yesterday because she was pardoned by President Moon Jae-in. So there was one about, and the analysts point out that there's no way that North Korea will accept Yoon's offer, economic incentives for nuclear weapons. It's not going to happen. And so analysts predict that under this new Yoon government, we'll very likely see North Korean nuclear problem deteriorate rapidly. And so that's one update. Another update that I have is that on the same day, on the day of Yoon's inauguration, South Korea and the United States kicked off 2-week combined air drills, including F-35A assets. So imagine on the day of your inauguration, US and South Korea is having this very provocative air drills. And third of the day I want to mention is that before the last person, foreign official that President Moon Jae-in met was actually Chinese Vice President Wang, who was going to attend Yoon's inauguration. And so in other words, what this, I think, update, just even based on the 3 update, what we're showing is that South Korean politics has to be understood within the broader geopolitical context. I think that is going to be my main point, and also following Tim's argument. So the title of my talk is In the Line of Fire, South Korea and the US Cold War with China. Now, admit that this title sounds a little bit ominous, and especially in this time. And one thing that I want to point out, that when we say, I mean, as an academic person, I think we have to be, we have to be kind of careful about using these. You have to define what Cold War means. I think that the Cold War we're talking right now is very different from previous Cold War, where it was basically the Cold War between USSR and United States. And at the time, Soviet Union were not really integrated economically with the West. But the kind of Cold War, new Cold War that we have right now, especially now launching against China, is that it's a fully integrated, neoliberalized, globalized economic environments. And basically, U.S. is saying that we're refusing to coexist. We decide not to coexist with the new rising, economically powerful China. So as you can already see, there's a dilemma problem right there. And also, new Cold War means that United States cannot possibly fight this Cold War alone. So hence, you need Japan, you need Australia, you need South Korea, and so all these alliances will be serve as force multipliers. So that is, I think, the context. So what it means is that, as you can see, pretty much my titles give you the argument. Now, what I'm going to point out is about, like mentioned, 4 points. One is about the election itself. And in fact, I have written an op-ed piece about the election itself. And also, I have presented 2 weeks ago, I have presented to our Korea Peace New England friends and colleagues there. So those of you who have seen my presentation there, you can do multitasking and, because pretty much this is just the updated one. So I'm going to argue that although Yoon has exhibited pretty hawkish rhetoric, but there's no mandate. Election has nothing to do. It was not about foreign policy. It was not about North Korea. It was not about U.S. even North Korean relations. It was purely, mostly domestic politics. So Yoon's coming out with a very radical, far right, hawkish idea. It does not go along with the rest of Korean people. And secondly, North Korea threat, so-called North Korea threat, that he also, not only Yoon himself, but also Team Biden uses, it's a threat that justifies U.S. forward protection into Asia. And third point is that, especially with Yoon being very, as I'm going to point out to you later, and also Tim has pointed out in his article, in his excellent article, is South Korea is being conceived as a subordinate partner to the U.S.-Japan dyad. So the U.S. Japan, South Korea, trilateral military alliance. That's where I think that they're trying to head. And lastly, I want to think about Singapore's alternative vision in which nations can coexist, and maybe somewhat ideal, but I think it's still important to have the alternative vision. So the main argument of my article, my talk will be Yoon's victory provides Washington with a carte blanche to thrust South Korea into the front lines of the new US-led Cold War against China, while using the North Korean threat as a cover for the rapidly expanding US military projection into Asia. Now, so this is the one about the election itself. This was the short op-ed piece that I published on Counterpunch. And my argument there was, as I summarized briefly a minute ago, that the election, there was no mandate for U.S. Yoon Seok-yeol's hawkish pivot. It was only, he won by 0.7 victory margin, which could be, as my good friend KJ No pointed out, it could be statistical error. And nevertheless, Yoon has been he really escalated his rhetoric. He talked about preemptive strike. He also talked about how after he got elected, before even he won the election, he's differentiated himself from President Moon Jae-in. He said that he declared North Korea as Pyongyang as Seoul's main enemy. which was departure from President Moon. And also he amplified this rhetoric, and he adopted the position of, as I mentioned earlier, CVID, which means that complete verifiable irreversible denuclearization with respect to North Korea. What that means is North Korea should be completely disarm and what you call show the genuine willing interest and show, evidence for complete denuclearization before any other promises of economic relief, etc. And also Yoon's delegation who visited Washington 3 weeks ago, they also stressed the CVID strategy, which again, I point out that most analysts feel that it's not going to work out. And so in that also article, I pointed out that, some of those even mainstream American analysts like Daniel DePatris, he said, the chances of Kim relinquishing his nuclear deterrent at this late stage in the game is somewhere between slim to none. In other words, North Korea is not going to give up nuclear weapons at this stage when still it's facing hostile United States and there's no security guarantee.
Simone,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the screen is blank.
It's blank?
Yeah, the shared screen is blank. I'm wondering if you could.
Was it blank the whole time?
No, just
No,
now.
at the beginning it was showing, but now the slide is blank.
It's still blank?
No, now we just see 0.7% conservative.
Okay, all right. I wonder why that happened. Okay, thanks for pointing that out. All right. So as I pointed out, let me know if there's another problem. Now, so the victory margin was about 0.7%, and as I pointed out, this is very slim margin that cannot be mandated for his hawkish pivot. And the election, so my point is that the election was more about the voters' anger at the failed progressive reforms. But nevertheless, though, if you look at the data, for the first time, there were more votes for liberals and progressive than conservatives. In other words, total votes, although liberal Lee Jae-myung candidate lost, more votes for liberal and progressive parties that put together 50.3%, as opposed to 48% that went to conservative party. So that will show that those of who are looking at the what to do now, I think it gives some hope. And also Yoon's, as I pointed out, the Yoon's hardline policy is unpopular among Korean voters. And the Koreans have consistently shown their strong public support for inter-Korean engagement. As you recall that during the height of Moon Jae-in's engagement, even the Koreans' approval rating for Kim Jong-un, North Korean Kim Jong-un was about close to more than 80%. So which will give you the idea what Koreans think about the inter-Korean relations. So here is Yoon going back to his hawkish rhetoric, and this was
it's blank again.
I'm very sorry about that. Is this still blank?
Yes. It was fine just now, just before, but now it's blank.
The PDF you sent us before contains these slides, but we're not seeing them as you display them.
Because I'm sharing the Google slides. Is it still blank?
Yes.
Yeah.
The ones with the black background work, but the ones with the white background don't work.
Huh. That's pity.
Yep.
This
one's working. We can see it.
I'm so sorry. Oh my God, this is such pity. So majority of South Koreans. So I guess you'll just have to let me know when it's blank. Okay. I know it's kind of disruptive, but otherwise I can just do without PowerPoint slides. So majority of South Koreans want a peace treaty with the North. This is the survey, that research done by the professor, and it's a pretty recent data, and which shows that even among the Yoon Seok-yeol voters, people who are going to vote for Yoon Seok-yeol, and they very slim margin. Actually, they had more than, I guess, close to 50%. They wanted to peace treaty with the North Korea. Okay. Can you see this screen, the data?
Just the title.
Just the title. What a pity. Okay. Okay, now, so what I'm going to do is then, let me see. That's pretty. Let me see. So what do you see right now?
That's fine.
Yeah, we can see fine.
I wonder why. Okay, so let me. Sorry about that. I guess I was just using the Google this slide instead of a PDF or PowerPoint. It worked last time, but I don't know why it doesn't work. But anyway, so the main point is that what explained this then hawkish pivot? I think 3 points. Washington's top priority is to build a military presence in Northeast Asia. Now, let me try to go back to slideshow mode. Like it's gonna. Do you see the full screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So Washington's top priority is to build a military presence in Northeast Asia. And the second point is that North Korea's threat is a pretext for US containment of China, and resolution of North Korea threat will, pretty much rob US of justification for its ever expanding military projection into Asia. And with that, North Korea threat will be actually is feeding into the tension in the Korean Peninsula, especially in regard to US-China tensions. And also North Korean threat sells pretty well to American public as well as conservative in Korea. So according to Chomsky, North Korean threat provides justification for the right-wing regime in the South, and also relaxation with North Korea would mean conservative losing power. So in this case, conservative won, as in the case of Yoon, election. So this explains why conservative in South Korea does not want to support engagement. This was so what explained, I think that with regard to Biden administration, I think the teams has already pointed out, and also his excellent article pointing out, is that Biden has already made it pretty clear that it's going to adopt very militaristic approach to the Far East. And this article team shows very clearly his appointees from the hawkish think tank basically showed that the potential for renewed tension with the North Korea, as well as the Cold War with China. This was published in 2021, and we can already see that that's where we are heading. Now, so if you look at all the things that I've said, pretty much this map will basically is its evidence. You can see the U.S.
So people also can't see your face very much. You only your top of your face, and there was a request about that. So.
Oh my God, this has been such a disaster. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You have about 5 to 7 minutes left.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I guess I should. As I pointed out, I am doing from work, so I should have gone. I should have be at home and doing from my home. But anyway, let me try to. Let me try to do as best as I can. So these are, if you cannot see the screen, I guess I will just explain. What you're showing is that U.S. bases in South Korea, and this is again to show the point of how the main purpose of U.S. policy is that having the military forward base in South Korea. Now, with regard to the Yoon's foreign policy team, it's very much related to connected to the Biden team that is pro Japan and trying to formulate this sort of trilateral military alliance. And this is a quote from Kim's article where what Campbell sees that Japan and its right-wing ruling Liberal Democrat Party as a linchpin of U.S. alliance system in Asia region, and views South Korea as a subordinate partner to US and Japan efforts to force North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons and contain the growing military power of China. Now, and I just like a minute ago, I said that how Yoon's hawkish team is about is in line with Biden's team. And his team is especially really diehard pro-US, pro-Japanese enablers, which he resurrected from foreign policy cabinets of disgraced conservative President Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. And especially what concerns many people is that he actually resurrected all those these foreign policy team who was very pushing for U.S., Korea, Japan military alliance. And the gentleman that you're seeing, the picture is that the Kim Tae-yeol, he's going to be in charge of, he's basically #1 in the in national security. Now, and how so far Yoon has been, obviously he made it, and what are their risk factors? And even I'm quoting two people. One is from actually from conservative and a very progressive analyst. Let's say Scott Snyder, who is a counselor on foreign relations. He said that Yoon has already demonstrated the risk of missteps in terms of expanding political capital on the wrong issues, especially moving Blue House to the defense ministry compound. And others point out that KJ No, who is activist and analyst, he pointed out that Yoon is, he's kind of loose cannon. He's very unpredictable. He's in a way. So there are these are Yoon's risk factors. And Yoon's, that shows that Yoon's approval rating right now, even before he inaugurated, is like 41%, which is the lowest of all his predecessors. So which shows that, again, what the Koreans, not only Koreans, also if you look at the international press, is very concerned about Yoon's ability. Now, nevertheless, I think as a team point out that, Washington is very happy for the obvious reason that the team also pointed out, and to continue to implement the same policies, failed policies, pressure, more pressure, although those policies failed. So what is to sum up, what I'm looking at is basically this Yoon's pivot and also Team Biden's pivot, hawkish pivot is basically to help, right? US policies help ensure a useful state of instability in the peninsula. North Korea will, this is kind of projection, North Korea will advance its nuclear program to deter US unless there are some major changes in policy. South Korea will remain a semi-occupied subservient force multiplier to serve Washington's growing strategic interest in Asia. And Yoon's victory is a component of a transnational hawkish pivot that threatens peace and stability in the all of Northeast Asia. I think those are the main points, and I can stop. And then let me see. So the outcome, what I will see from 5 years from now, is going to be about the unless they have major shift in their policy, 5 years from now, the Biden and Yoon administration will have run their courses. North Korea will not have been denuclearized, and the Korean War will be closing in the 9th decade. But Washington will have further cemented its forward strategic position in Asia at the expense of South Korean independence and self-determination. Okay, I think that I will pause there. And I had couple of other issues about now NATO is also trying to expand to Northeast Asia and Korea, and South Korea is Yoon is most likely to join the Quad in the Pacific plan, and finally, as I mentioned, that it's nevertheless it's time to think about the alternative vision that in which nations can coexist. Okay, so let me pause there, and sorry about my technical issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry about the technical issues as well. Well, Simon's, both our speakers' presentation, I think, show us clearly how complicated situation has become, it was already very complicated, but with the addition of Yoon government with a loose cannon like Yoon, who is useful to the conservatives in the US or the global empire US, still could be a problem. And there were a number of questions on the chat. If you have any questions, please write that your question on the chat as well. I will read a few questions from that was already written there, and we could go from there. Okay, so one question, I think some of them are already answered by multiple people, but we could deal with a few of them at least. South Korea's role in on the Korean Peninsula. That's a very difficult issue and thorny issue among South Koreans as well. The agreement after the Korean War or during the armistice agreement of the Korean War, two parties were North Korea and the US, but South Korea actually showed during the last administration showed that they could play some role, actually. It may not have gone very far, but they could play some role. And I think that's a good point to get some opinions from the presenters. Another is the North Korea's nuclear power versus South Korea's nuclear positions. It has been shifting from Moon Jae-in trying to limit and abolish, wean out of nuclear power plant, and Yoon's effort to resurrect it. The third question was, I think, the South Korean people's feeling. I think partially was actually handled by our presenters, but feelings about the military power presence in South Korea, US military presence in South Korea. Could you begin, Tim, with your responses?
That's pretty broad. What's the question?
Whichever that makes sense to you, you could, address.
Let me, when I was, thinking back over, sort of the history of U.S. South Korean conflict today, I remember, when I was talking about U.S. Trying to counter even Korean conservative presidents, right? It's important to remember that, the first president who was elected after democracy, No Tae-woo. He was convicted for what he did in Gwangju, and he was eventually pardoned, but he was the first elected president after democracy in the first direct election, and under his government in 1991. South Korea and North Korea signed this non-aggression treaty, which was a surprise to a lot of people. But, it showed that it wasn't just him. I mean, it showed that there was interest within South Korea to do something about it, not involving the United States, right? And so that was actually a very important step, and it really was a historic step. And a lot of the South Korean intelligence officials who were involved in that stayed involved for decades, and some of them were even brought back under Moon Jae-in. So there's this kind of continuity in some ways about the way they have dealt with North Korea. generally the right wingers tend to be more hawkish and so on, but you can't always predict or put them in a box, but like that. And so, like I was surprised to learn that under No Tae-woo, who I always just considered a vicious dictator who somehow got elected, under him, South Korea, its national health card system started under No Tae-woo, partly, recognizing the real needs of the Korean people at the time. So it's really difficult to predict, but I think that, like I said, like the South Korean have often challenged American policy, not always publicly. And it's like, she just was talking about this gentleman who's, wants Japanese military apparently back in South Korea. These kind of people are really right. I mean, that is an idea that like 20 years ago would be completely unacceptable to almost all Koreans, to have Japanese military involvement. And so there's been a real shift. And partly, of course, it has to do with the dynamics with North Korea and their development of their nuclear program and the fact that they've got this deterrent force. But as someone pointed out, South Korea's economy is far, far larger than North Korea's, 7 times, I think it is, or something like that. And their military is far more powerful, except they don't have nukes. But, you could see if you followed South Korea day by day, they're testing all kinds of missiles. They're testing all kinds of, weapons. And so they have their own capability. And I think, part of what the U.S. does with South Korea and Japan is that, Japan spends more money on its military, but it doesn't, its constitution still prohibits Japanese forces from going overseas. And that's probably not going to change. They want to sell weapons and so on, but in many ways, the South Korean military, takes the place of a large Japanese military, and the U.S. likes it that way. They want to have Japan be more militaristic, but they also want it to be under the control of the U.S. And so South Korea, by having this large military, is able to kind of, play that role. And it's I think a real test is going to come to see if Yoon accepts the invitation from the Chinese leader to come. I think, probably his advisors that he's hired from the previous administrations will say, don't do that. But who knows what he might do.
Okay, thank you. Simon?
Yeah, I think that I think simple answer about regarding question about South Korea's role in the Korean Peninsula is South Korea cannot exert its full sovereignty, rise of sovereignty. So it's I think Moon tried it. I think we saw definitely, there was a limitation and constraint and failure, and it will be subordinated to United States foreign policy goal. That is, at this point, it is pretty much containing China. And I think, and also Yoon's case, yes, there's invitation from China about the Yoon's visit, but I think that pretty much United States will have to approve that for Yoon to, go ahead with that. And there's other questions about what South Koreans feeling about the American military presence. According to the survey, the mainstream survey says, 80 to 90% of Koreans support U.S. South Korea alliance, which means that even after, hypothetically, even after unification, Koreans would like to see American bases there. But that's more sort of a mainstream view. But on the other hand, I think that if you look at all the, I did have prepared slides about the consequences of U.S. bases in U.S. bases in Korea. And I think, on the other hand, when people were asked about specific questions about the South Korea's sharing of the defense cost and others, are pretty critical. And so yes, Koreans have been for more than almost 7 decades have been under almost like a semi-U.S. rule that the Koreans, unlike people in Philippines and other areas more critical of U.S. bases, Koreans, South Koreans definitely more, I think positively. So I think this is something that's issue that we need to raise. We need to raise awareness. And also, I think there was also about the new American Philip Goldberg, the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, and he was in charge of enforcing those U.S. UN sanctions on North Korea. So he's pretty hawkish, and he is that he supports CBID. So it's I don't think we have any pro-engagement ambassador to Seoul, unfortunately.
One thing I forgot to mention in terms of Biden and his Asia team is that one of the reasons that I think Biden's team is just fine with this new Yoon administration is that the policies that they support, like especially getting Japan and Korea together, those are really pushed under President Obama too. And it was under President Obama. Obama considered, he was real tight with President Lee. He considered him his best friend in Asia and would say this over and over, this really super right-wing hawkish guy, right? And during the Park Geun-hye administration, there was an agreement on the so-called comfort women, women who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. And there was this, and Japan and Korea couldn't get together until they kind of resolved this issue. And so the US really pounded on them to resolve it. And they did under Park, but it was a very unsatisfactory agreement to many Koreans, and Moon Jae-in government actually did away with the agreement because the main reason that they did away with it was because the comfort women, none of the women were consulted on the agreement. And a lot of people just in Korea just felt that was really disgraceful. But the guy that was most instrumental in, getting the U.S., pushing the U.S. line and negotiating with Japan and Korea was Tony Blinken, who is now the Secretary of State. At the time, he was the Deputy National Security Advisor to Obama. So, he's been in the middle of these negotiations, and that one blew up on him under Moon. So now he'll be back with somebody, and Yoon has said he wants to, bring back this really pathetic agreement, which basically left these women out in the cold. And of course, many of them are dying because they're old. But it's just a sign of, how the Biden people view South Korea. And it's the same, many of the same people. His national security advisor now was very involved back then too. And Kurt Campbell, of course, is the guy that came up with this whole Asia pivot idea when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. So it's the same people trying to push the same policies, except in a more hawkish way towards China. And that's where I really, that's one of my words. That's where I just really depart from the Biden administration on their whole, basically their whole foreign policy. But that's where it's like really, I think they're playing with fire there, because they could easily lose support in South Korea. And people have said, what about the U.S. bases? Why are South Koreans so accepting of U.S. bases? And I replied, one of the reasons is that the U.S. was very clever. They consolidated the military bases in this Camp Humphrey, which is, Pyeongtaek. It's about 80 miles south of Seoul. So and that big patch of land that Simone showed in the middle of Seoul is Yongsan Garrison, which the U.S. was the military headquarters for decades. They took over from the Japanese, and now they're in the process of shutting that down. And but everything has been consolidated, even bases that were along the border with at the DMZ. There's only a small number of American forces on the DMZ. It's just a very small artillery brigade. And there used to be the whole 2nd Division was up there in Dongducheon, which is right just north of Seoul. So like the U.S. has been, they recognize, in the 90s, people might remember there was a whole movement, national movement about the U.S. forces and their cruel treatment of women, and there was a terrible murder that happened near the Camp Casey, where a Korean prostitute was brutally murdered by an American GI, and at the time, that GI was going to be tried in U.S. military court, and Korean people demanded that he be tried in in Korean courts. And that was the first time a U.S. GI was ever tried in a Korean court, and he was convicted. Of course, his term was limited, and he came back to the U.S. eventually. But so there has been this real anger about U.S. bases, and so this consolidating them was politically very clever, because it's not in people's faces all the time, like it is kind of in Japan. In Japan, the U.S. has almost complete control over their airspace. It's unbelievable. A few months ago, people had video in the news and Japanese media where American helicopters flying right over Tokyo, and they're like no other aircraft can do that, and the U.S. can just do it whenever they want. And I heard Bruce Cummings say one time, it's almost difficult to believe that Japan is even a sovereign country, so like it is, but like I also just said to somebody, like the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party in Japan, this right-wing party, they've basically been in control since 1955. They keep getting reelected, but that's a long time. So they've developed this really close, subservient relationship with the U.S., where they're so servile, they'll just destroy their whole island of Okinawa to build another base for the U.S. Marines, even though the whole island wants them removed. That's how the servility of the Japanese LDP, to me, is just an unbelievable situation, that we would want to have an ally like that would just do everything we say. So South Korea is a little bit more independent, and they will speak out. So I think that there's some hope that they can resist some of this, pushing toward, confrontation with China.
Okay, thank you so much. It's getting late, so I just want to wrap up by mentioning that it's been great to have these two distinguished speakers. The situation in the world and on the Korean Peninsula is changing every minute, every day, and it's getting complicated. It's important for us to be up to date. I think the complexity is very well presented today, and just by the fact that even though this subservient conservative Yoon government is overall beneficial to U.S. and its empire, it's also a loose cannon that U.S. should contain and control by sending a not so important person to the inauguration party, for example. That's the South Korean interpretation. They think that U.S. does not want the situation to be inflamed too quickly. So that said, I think there are actually a lot that we can do to support Korean people's effort. one of which is to support the Peace on the Korean Peninsula bill by Congressman Sherman. Is it Sherman last name? Sorry. And please go to that link I posted on chat and sign up for the virtual advocacy that's planned in June, I believe, and support the bill. Let's make the conversation and reconciliation keep going, and bring peace sooner. Okay, thank you everyone for staying so long, and good night.
For listening.
Bye.
Thank you to our panelists.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.